Please welcome Kathy Kelly.
Hello, good evening, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I've been a guest here at the monastery for the past 4 days, and it's a wonderful place to be welcomed. I'm quite grateful, and I'm certainly grateful to all of the people who are part of Benedictines for Peace and other groups that have helped to bring us together. It's great to see the students here from Wesleyan, Ohio. We're really fortunate to have this opportunity to be together, to think about the cost of war and the price of peace. If anybody came from a more ordinary background than mine, it would be frightening. And I truly was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. When I was a kid, we thought my mom was a mutant because we only had 3 children. And everybody else in the neighborhood had 6 and 9, the Lindmans had 12, the ladies had 13, and we only had 3. And so we did what Catholic children would do in those days. We would pray novenas on the living room floor in front of the couches, and we particularly dedicated those novenas to St. Gerard. His picture was framed on the wall. And then my mother gave birth to twins, so I thought my prayers were pretty effective. And then 11 months later, my brother Jerry was born, so there were 3 in 1 year. And when Dad had come home from Mercy Hospital, we were at the door, was it a boy, was it a girl? And my dad had said, both. And St. Gerard came off the wall. And I don't want to tell you how long it was before I ever figured out that it wasn't my fervent prayers popping all those babies into it. So I came from a very ordinary background. I was somebody who was fortunate to have been taught by religious women, the Sisters of Charity, and later the Sisters of St. Joseph. They never showed the slightest interest in accumulating personal wealth. As a way of saying thank you to all the Benedictines here, may I repeat that? They never showed the slightest interest in accumulating personal wealth. They shared resources, they lived simply, they taught us cheerfully. And so I want to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to the religious women here tonight. I didn't have a political thought in my head through most of my younger years, but I did eventually move from teaching in a kind of posh Jesuit college prep school to teaching kids in my own neighborhood. I had moved to the poorest neighborhood in Chicago, and I was teaching the Harrison Gents and the Latin Kings, and it was a small alternative school, and the students in my classes weren't surviving their teenage years. We would have more funerals than graduations in this small school, and the students would sometimes be addicted, sometimes they'd be in prison, and every year at least 3 would be dead. And I couldn't keep that up as though it was normal, and really I can't give you a point A to point B connection here, but for me and for quite a few others in my neighborhood who were doing either social work or teaching or healthcare, we got it into our heads and hearts that as long as the money was being poured into building up a nuclear weapons arsenal in the United States during the Cold War, we should take a stronger stand to protect that. And so we decided to plant corn on nuclear missile silos to try to prevent the buildup of nuclear weapons. And that landed me in prison for 1 year. I sometimes say that I taught in Catholic girls' high schools long enough that I had a little bit of extra preparation, but maximum security federal prison. But what I'd like to do is tell you a few soldier stories, beginning with that point in my life. And for me, it's been important to stay with each one of these stories. The first comes from the day of planting corn on the nuclear missile silo sites. It was a beautiful August summer afternoon. The mist was rising from the ground, the crickets were chirping, the birds were out, and my heart was hammering because I thought, what if I don't make it over that barbed wire fence? Well, I got over to the other side and I did what was And then I sat down on the lid of this intercontinental ballistic missile to wait and see what was going to happen next. And there was kind of a whir being made by the missile, but otherwise, when I calmed down, I could realize what a beautiful morning it was. And then all of a sudden, a vehicle came speeding down the country road, skidded to a stop, gravel and dust all around, and 4 soldiers in full military garb, helmet, combat boots, camouflage outfits, walkie-talkies, surrounded the perimeter of this intercontinental ballistic missile site and crouched down, and one said into his walkie-talkie, "All personnel, please clear the site." Well, I was going to do whatever they said. This was kind of new for all of us. And so they told me to put my hands in the air and step to the left and step to the right. And then I thought, oh, please don't make me cross that fence in front of you. But they had the key. So they opened the fence, and I was handcuffed and knelt down. And there was a fellow with a gun at my head, not on it. And then 3 of the soldiers took off. I think maybe to find out what does chapter 2 of the manual say to do, because this was kind of new for all of us. So they left this one young fellow with me, and at this point I can't tell you exactly what happened because I never turned around. I just stared straight ahead. But I think I'm sort of preternaturally extroverted. I might have lasted about a minute and a half in silence. And then I just started talking, and I told this young man pretty much what I've just told you. And then I asked him, "Do you think the corn will grow?" And he said, "I don't know, man, but I sure hope so." And then I asked him, "Would you like to say a prayer?" "Yes, ma'am." So then I said the St. Francis Peace Prayer. "Lord, make me a channel of your peace. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be pardoned as to pardon, to be loved as to love with all my soul." And he said, "Amen." And then he said to me, "Ma'am, would you like a drink of water?" And I was very thirsty. I said, "Oh, yes, please." And then he asked me, "Ma'am, would you please tip your head back?" And I did. And I could still feel that water dribbling down my chin. Now that young soldier took a risk to do an act of kindness for a complete stranger. And I must have seemed pretty strange. Well, one of the good things about growing older is you get to have bookends in your life. So a second soldier story I'd like to tell you comes from 2003. Marlene had mentioned that companions and I were in Iraq all through the shock and awe bombing, and it was shocking and it was awful for everyone involved. And when the Marines came into Baghdad, we were pretty stunned. They pulled up and parked a long line of armored personnel carriers, jeeps, Humvees, tanks, every kind of beige military landborne vehicle you could imagine right outside the hotel, where we had been under quite heavy bombardment. We were right across the road from a landfill in the Tigris River with a lot of military installations. So I think when the Marines looked up at the balcony of our hotel, they must have wondered, where's their spaceship? Who are these people? We had strung big vinyl photos of the most beautiful children you could ever imagine. And we had banners that said, "Life is sacred," and "War equals terror," period. And this little girl, Dima, had been the first to spot them. Dima was very close to my heart. Over the course of the bombing, she at times would look up at her father with a very apologetic look, and she'd be standing in a pool of her own urine, and little Dima had completely lost control of her bladder. She was so frightened by the bombing. But this day, she was very excited, and she came running down the hallway, "Janud, Janud, Askari!" And we joined her, and that's when we started to watch the soldiers coming out of the hatches of their vehicles. And I remember, to me, it looked like, the line at the grocery store where all the Gerber baby jars are? They looked looked so young, these young faces coming out of the military vehicles. Or you know the scene from The Wizard of Oz where Glinda comes out, come out, Mary. And I never told the Marines that, but that's what it looked like to me. As they began to come out. And so one of the Marines shouted out to us, "Who are you?" And our friend Neville from Perth, Australia, a lawyer and also a minister of the United Church of Christ, said very in a dignified way, "We're a peace team." And then one of the Marines called out, "Well, where are you from?" And Neville called back, "Perth, Australia." And then down the line, "New York, Chicago, Boston." And then one of the Marines said, "Hey, you from Boston? You a Red Sox fan?" And that kind of broke the ice. And holding my banner, I looked over at Cynthia, who was 72 years old at the time, and I said, "They look awfully thirsty, don't they?" And Cynthia dropped her end of the banner. She said, "I'm so glad you said that. Of course that's the right thing to do." And Cynthia went right over to where we had many bottles of water, big, heavy 6-packs of bottled water, picked up a 6-pack of bottled water in each arm, and Cynthia went down to deliver water to the newly arrived Marines. And I sort of stood still like I was a statue or something, waiting for a pigeon to stop on my head. And I was actually thinking, well, maybe we should have a consensus meeting first. And then I realized, of course, every Iraqi family we had met had given us relentless hospitality. Come in, sit down, join us for a meal, sleep on the rooftop with us, handed us their babies, shared food that was sometimes going to mean they wouldn't have a meal the next 2 days. And so I remembered I had stuck some dates underneath my bed in case we really ran out of food. And I went and grabbed those and got some water and went downstairs. And the first one I wanted to talk to was a Marine who had come out of his armored personnel carrier and did something so wise. He opened up an Army-issued novel and started to read. And it just had a calming effect, which was needed because we knew there were snipers positioned at various places. And if one of those had opened fire on the Marines, it would have been a terrible firefight. Anyway, he did that, and I went up to him and asked him, "What are you reading?" And he said, "Heart of Darkness, ma'am. It's my 13th time reading it. Joseph Conrad's novel of good and evil at a time of imperial overspread." So I went over and gave my water to 2 other Marines, and pretty soon they were telling me their names. One was Tom and one was Jerry. I said, "That's right, we're Tom and Jerry." And this fellow said, "Yeah, you could call us Hoosiers. We're from Indiana. And would you like to see a picture of my wife and kids?" And he opened up a Velcro. Next thing I knew, he was showing me pictures of his wife and children. And so there commenced about 12 days in Baghdad, during the first days of that invasion in Baghdad, of exchanges, conversation, shared prayer with the newly arrived Marines. It was my chance to give water back. But there's a third story I have to tell, and it's not as easy to tell. It's not as easy to remember, really. Many of you would have heard of the School of the Americas. If you haven't, I encourage you to Google it. It's a very interesting campaign. There is a school in Fort Benning, Georgia, where soldiers from other countries primarily have been trained to go back to their own countries and engage in what's been in the courts now a series of convictions for death squads, murders, torture, massacres. And so every year a group of people have gone to the School of the Americas to have a completely nonviolent witness. Well, when I came back from Iraq after the shock and awe bombing, I felt that I was ready to cross a line at a military base where I knew military police were also, American military police, being trained to go to Iraq, and eventually it was military police from that base that were involved in the Abu Ghraib scandal. So it just for me was the right place to go, the right thing to do. I wasn't really even thinking all that much about what was going to happen next, because it wasn't my first season out for crossing the line at a military base. So I was arrested and I was put on a bus, and there were, I think, 45 other people that day that had taken the same action. So they had a big room, about the size of this room, all set up to process us as prisoners. And I was doing just what I was told. I was told to go to Station J. But one thing I noticed is that there were at least 4 people in full military garb processing each prisoner, and one person with a checklist seemed to be kind of like a supervisor. And when I got to Station J, the orders were being screamed at me and at others in the room. And this is curious to me, but, raise your hands, spread your legs, raise your hands higher. And there commenced a search, which was the most aggressive search I'd ever experienced. Hands inside of clothing, squeezing, shoving. And so I was told to raise my left leg higher, and I lost my balance, and another balance came. And I thought, I know too many heroes of the civil rights movement and other movements who didn't cooperate with this kind of behavior. And so I turned my head and I just asked the person screaming the orders, could you help me understand why you're screaming at me? Well, I took a tone, yes. Don't say anything! Keep your eyes glued on the soldier ahead of you! Raise your arms higher! And that's when I thought, And very quietly, I lowered my arms and said, I'm sorry. I can't cooperate with this any longer. Bang! I was down on the floor in about 5 seconds. I had a black eye from the impact. My wrists were tied. My ankles were tied. My wrists and ankles were tied together. They call it hog tie. And somebody who was about your size was kneeling on me and referring to me with an expletive. This, and I couldn't breathe. And so I said, excuse me, but this really hurts. I can't breathe. Nothing. No response. And I thought, well, I'm going to pass out. I have to try again. So I said again, this is really hurting me. I can't breathe. No response. And I never experienced anything like this. I couldn't believe nobody else was running to help me. Well, it turned out that Joe Mulligan, a Jesuit priest, thought that Kathy Kelly had a heart attack, and one of the other people that was right next to the station I was at had tried to come and help me, and they put him in a pain control so that he was writhing in pain himself. So while I was in a pinch, I said, look, I've had 4 lung collapses in the past, which is true. I was born with congenital diseased tissue on my lungs, and I did have 4 lungs, but my lungs were glued up. But I needed to say something. So, and I can't breathe. That did it. The fellow who was about your size got off of me, and I got full breaths, and I was okay. Now, it's very important that you stay with this part of this story. They had to take me to the next station where they take your picture, but the tie had been taken out of my hair because I was kind of upside down. My hair was in front of my face when they propped me up again, kneeling, and still hog-tied. And nobody could take a picture of my face because of the hair in front of my face. So, the soldier who carried me under my right armpit said to me, excuse me, ma'am, but in order to take your picture, I'm going to need to move the hair from in front of your face. Will that be all right? And I said, oh, yeah, that's fine. And he moved the hair from in front of my face, and then ever so gently, he squeezed my shoulder. I know that those cuffs are real tight, man. We're going to get them off of you as soon as we can. Well, I needed that. And isn't that the way it so often happens? Just when you think the lights have gone out, humanity is on the blink, humanity reasserts itself. And so I still feel very, very grateful to that young soldier and his kind words. But I also have to remember that prior experience when I was hog-tied. I have to remember it because in Iraq, in Afghanistan, type of choice that is part of what are called night raids. And they are despised in Afghanistan. You will hear repeatedly that the United States troops are coming home from Afghanistan. But the Pentagon says differently. The United States bases, the big, huge bases, are starting to close down. But it seems that the strategy the United States wants to pursue is a combination of the Special Operations Forces. Now, these are the most highly trained, fearsome, and menacing warriors in the world. Marine Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs. These are the soldiers who will be coupled with security contractors who are outside the military but teamed up with the military to do night raids, to call in aerial bombardments, and to coordinate with drone surveillance and sometimes call in drone attacks. So they don't need the big, huge bases anymore. And when the night raids happen, they're generally happening by surprise at something like 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes the first step in a night raid is uncorking a grenade and throwing it over the courtyard. And you know, in the summertime, people sleep in their courtyards in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And one family in Pakistan told us that their 12-year-old daughter was sound asleep when all of a sudden a grenade landed on her cot and killed her instantly. And then soldiers burst in, and they hurl bodies around the room, and they tornado through a house, and they break things and rip things apart. And if anybody tries to stop them, then they're shoved aside, and the men are as quickly as possible hog-tied and put inside a pickup truck, or sometimes left out overnight on the patio of their own house, the main household are hog-tied. It's a nightmare of an experience. And very hard on those who engage in it as well. In fact, I'm going to use the word madness. There's a reporter who has written for a magazine that's not by any means a left-wing sort of magazine. It's called The American Scholar. His name is Neil Shea. And he embedded himself with a team that he fictitiously called the Destroyers. And he had gone as an embedded reporter with the military several times in the past. But he said in this article that he actually became afraid of the soldiers he had embedded himself with. And in the article, he describes night raids that were like demolition parties, where the soldiers kind of exulted in being able to be in a place where they could do things they'd never be allowed to do at home. It didn't qualify as war crime. But as Mr. Shea described it, they would do things that so upset the Afghan soldiers that were assigned to go out with them, that the Afghan soldiers would first ask them not to do things like shooting the dog or molesting the women. And they'd say, "Mister, please don't," and the American soldiers would laugh at them and break more items and behave in ways that would so enrage people in the villages, or even these other Afghan national soldiers, that there would be, at the end of the day, more support for the Taliban. And then the writer quotes this squadron sergeant. His name was Sergeant Gibbons, a fictitiously given name. He said, after a week of these night raids, "You know what? You could say we just did a week long of recruitment for the Taliban. And you know what? We had fun doing it. I like recruiting for the Taliban." Do you get what he was saying? That they would so anger the populace that people would be moving more and more towards support for the Taliban. And then he added, after he said, "I like recruiting for the Taliban, it's job security for us." And now the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King has said that we must try to have tough minds, tender hearts. Tough minds to analyze what is happening, what is going on in these situations, but tender hearts for every veteran that returns. Tender hearts for every returning veteran, even and especially Sergeant Gibbons. in the bluster and the bravado that he spoke with. Because there's a great deal of healing that's needed, and you know probably that there are now more suicides on the part of returning veterans than deaths from combat with regard to Afghanistan. I am very much a city person. When I've gone to Afghanistan, I kind of have to go outside of what I'm accustomed to, and it's a good way to learn. And so I'd like to talk with you about some of the learnings I've had just in the relationship between city and village, the difference when people live in pretty poor villages. But first I do want to say that with regard to that idea of madness, just on a very, very practical level, it can cost as much as $800 to fill 1 gallon of gasoline in any airborne or landborne vehicle traveling across Afghanistan. $800 for 1 gallon of gasoline. You might wonder if she's got her stats wrong. But you can check it out, 400 to 800, particularly when the route for the trucks coming into Afghanistan had to come through the north of the country. That's when the price went up to as much as $800. The United States has been spending $2 billion per week on the war in Afghanistan. $2 billion per week. Now, how can it be that expensive? Well, one of the main expenses is this charge for fuel. You see, the supplies don't come in by plane. Those planes would be too heavy if they were carrying all that fuel and ammunition and food and fuel and water. And so they come in by truck. And those roads that they move along are roads that have for a long time now been controlled by people involved in another huge nationwide industry. 93% of the world's opium comes from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan exports more marijuana than any other country in the world. So they're also using the roads, the drug lords. And the drug lords, I mean, I even saw this teaching the Harrison Jensen, the Latin Kings at my second floor window when I look out for my English class. You know, I could kind of see who was doing which transaction and who owned which corner. And you really had to make sure that you were paying if you were moving into somebody else's corner. Well, that's what happens when the United States trucks go along the roads that are controlled by drug lords and warlords. Congressman Tierney of New Jersey, 2 years in a row, has documented this impeccably. And all the congresspersons in the United States that get these reports, it's common news amongst the media, that the United States troops have to shell out thousands and then hundreds of thousands of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money to the Taliban, to the drug lords, to the warlords, reinforcing corruption in that country such that it now has been designated Afghanistan as the most corrupt country in the world. It kind of tied for that position with Somalia and North Korea. And much of the payout has to do with being able to move along these roads, but that's not the end of it. Now, if you go to one of the biggest military bases and drive along the perimeter of it toward the outskirts of Baghdad, you'll be driving for 20 minutes. That's how long this base's outdoor wall is. And you can watch, and convoys of trucks will go into that base all day long, carrying water and food and fuel. And next door, the Chari Kamba refugee camp, a sprawling refugee camp where families have to crowd together, has 8 children who died in the harsh, cold winter. They froze to death. The families don't have any way to get wood or coal or stoves in which to burn it. They scavenge for plastic and for bits of paper, and they try to warm themselves in the cold winter right across the street from this huge military base. 100 people altogether died in the cold winter. Last winter, they froze to death. And the families are hungry. And the men say to me, do you think that we like to live this way? And why are they there? Every day in Afghanistan, 400 people are forced from their land because of the war. And here in the United States, we're paying $2 billion a week to maintain our troops, and I'll bet next to nobody knows that the war displaces 400 people every single day. Imagine in these squalid, wretched refugee camps, they don't have latrines. They don't have access to clean water. 3/4 of the country doesn't have access to clean water. Imagine toddlers. Sometimes women talk about having to make a little hammock and put a baby over an open flame to try to thaw the child out. And how does the United States manage to get our public to keep going along with this? Again and again, we're told it's a humanitarian war. A humanitarian war? Such an oxymoron. A humanitarian war. That somehow we're protecting women and children in Afghanistan. I've heard it said by people in the peace movement. 1 out of every 11 women in Afghanistan dies in childbirth. A tortuous way to die. No doctors, no nurses, no midwives, no hospitals. 1 out of 5 children doesn't make it beyond the age of 5. Can we say we're protecting women who carry the bundles of their child's corpses to the cemeteries? 1 million children now suffering acute malnourishment in the south of Afghanistan especially, the very place where the troops are concentrated in the south and in the east. Why are we there? So I want to say a little bit of what I've learned in such gentle education from my friends in the Afghan Peace Volunteers, teenagers, young men and women. Well, I'll also tell you, I've got the blue passport. When I come back to the United States, it takes me about 8 seconds to readjust to having everything at my fingertips. Lights on, recharge everything, hot water when I want it, bathroom's always there, both taps work, wash the dishes in the sink. In Bamyan, where my young friends Gulabay and Ali were born and raised, when they want fuel, because they only get electricity between 1 and 3 in the morning, in spite of the United States having occupied that country for 11 years now, there's still not electricity, even in the provinces that are relatively safe, as Bamyan is. So to get fuel, these kids get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They ride their donkeys for 6 hours, and they ride and ride and ride till they find a place on a barren mountain where there's enough scrub brush and twigs and like tumbleweed that they can stuff into big burlap sacks on either side of the donkey. And when they've finished stuffing their sacks, they get on the donkey again and they ride 6 hours back. And lest you think that collecting the fuel is just a matter of picking up fuel that's sitting there waiting for you on the ground, they've got pickaxes in their sacks and they have to hit the mountain repeatedly and try to wrestle the fuel out of the mountainside. And can you imagine how quickly that fuel will burn when they get home? But the greater gravity of their situation now is that repeatedly, when sometimes little children, sometimes teenagers like my friends, sometimes women, are out on the mountainsides in the early mornings of pre-dawn, combat brigade unit helicopters from the United States have flown over the mountainside. And they've seen these images of people below, and they've mistaken them for Taliban fighters and opened fire. In one instance, there were 9 children, and they were collecting fuel, and when 2 combat brigade unit helicopters flew overhead, and these are the largest helicopters in the U.S. airborne arsenal. The engine for a combat brigade unit helicopter is the same engine used in an Abrams tank. These are enormous machines. The 2 helicopters flew up the mountainside, and then one went higher than the other, and there was a bright green flash, and then a gun protruded, and they shot 9 children. A tree cracked in half, and the leafy branches fell down on Wahidullah. So he was spared. And parents heard explosions in their village, and they must have been running up that mountainside, their hearts in their throats, hoping it wouldn't be what they might presume. And then they found the dismembered, bloody bodies of their beloved children. And little Wahidullah was so traumatized. And he told what he had seen. And General Petraeus apologized the next day. He said this tragic event should never have happened. 4 weeks later, 2 little boys were clearing an irrigation ditch, and they were killed. When President Obama gave the State of the Union address, 9 civilians had been killed in a similar fashion. This goes on sometimes weekly, always every month. We keep in Voices for Creative Nonviolence what we call the Afghan Atrocities Update. And it's a macabre task we think we must assign ourselves. And we glean the news from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and we register each time that U.S. and NATO troops have been responsible for the killing of civilians. Again, growing up in Chicago, we just took it for granted after you went to high school, you went to college. But in village life in Afghanistan, the education system nationally is so corrupt that most of the slots for going to a college or a university have already been sold or in some way given away as a perk to somebody in this corruption scam that goes on before the entrance test is even taken. So for the Namanti family in the Maidan Wardak province to have 2 boys who had gotten into university in Kabul was a source of great honor and pride. These kids got in by dint of their own studying. This family was poor. Well, they were doing well in their studies. Ismail was at the Kabul University. His brother Faribullah was at the Kabul Polytechnic University. It was the first night of Ramadan, the month of fasting, but when the sun goes down, families gather for a common meal, and if you can get home, you go home. And so the Namanti boys were on their way home like the conquering heroes. The night before, 2 men had appeared at the Namanti compound. They had knocked on the door. The family opened the door. The 2 men asked for food. Now, this is not the kind of an area where you can say, oh, look, 7-Eleven is down that way, or Motel 6 is over there. There's nothing. And when people ask for food and they have a long journey, they might not make it if you don't grant their request. And anyway, maybe these were Taliban fighters. And if you didn't give them food, maybe some of their companions would come back later and you'd be attacked. So the family gave them food. Now, it may be that those 2 asking for food had appeared on the screen of somebody in Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, sitting in a dimly lit trailer, who was working his shift or her shift as an Air Force pilot. Because you see now, the United States Air Force graduates more operators of drones than actual pilots that get in the cockpits and, fly the planes. And the drone operation task is sometimes to do surveillance and try to figure out who might be a bad guy, somebody to be assassinated, somebody who might be in a home, and at least there should be a night raid. And so the word came from the United States that there should be a night raid at the Namanti family home. The youngest boy had gone to be with his brothers, and he said they fell asleep over their books. And he thought when the United States troops came running into the house that they were trying to wake his brothers up. And his brother Ismail spoke enough English, and he was saying, we are students. But it was to no avail. There were already 3 pools of blood in the room, according to neighbors that came and gave reports. And Ismail had been pulled out of the room. He was shot outside the room. His 2 brothers were shot inside the room. All 3 died, and on the other side of the compound, another brother, Buranullah, had a bag over his head that an Afghan interrogator had put over his head while he asked the questions that the night raid United States soldiers told him to ask. Asked him, where are the guns? And then they'd hit him on the head. Where are the guns? They'd beat him again. And finally, Motorola had screamed out, if you find guns, come and kill me with those guns. There are no guns here. He didn't know yet that his 3 brothers had been killed. And the next day, the United States issued an apology. We're sorry. We had the wrong house. And the villagers were up in arms. They were so angry. Why did you kill these students? Just in today's news, Afghans are just beside themselves because the CIA tortured a young student that they had pulled out of his university campus. These stories go on and on. I was saying to Sister Marlene, I have O negative blood, so when I go to the emergency hospital in Kabul, they're always glad to see me because that's a very good kind of blood that they always want donated. So I've had quite a few chances to be at the emergency hospital. I stayed with them in their hospitals for a week at one point, and there's a young nurse, Felipe. He's so energetic, and he's a bit on the impish, humorous side too, and he knows that when you break down that $2 billion per week, it comes out to $1 million per soldier in Afghanistan. $1 million to keep one soldier in Afghanistan for 1 year. And so Felipe said to me, Agora, just like you say 6 of them, goodbye, you go home, you give me this $6 million, what I do, And you could build another hospital with $6 million. He said, just like you said, maybe 60 home, how many? Well, one day I was at the emergency hospital, and I mean, I'm no kind of a doctor or a nurse, but I guess I just looked Western. And so this young child came up to me, and his head was completely bandaged, only one eye was showing, but I could see tears coming out of that one eye. And he said to me, I think I have lost my eye forever. I think I have lost my eye forever. And he thought maybe I was a German doctor and I could get him help and he could get his eye restored. And inside the hospital ward where the children are, Esmatullah was just beaming because the physical therapist had introduced him to me, patting him on the head saying, he's a real Pashtun. And all these changes of dressings that he's undergone, he has never cried once. And Esmatullah was very proud and very brave. A few beds down, Saifullah had been a driver for the United States Army. I should say Esmatullah never knew which side hit him. He was just at the mosque with his father. Saifullah was a driver, and his luck had held out for 2 years, and then he drove over an improvised explosive device, the car jackknifed, when it came down, he'd lost both legs. And Saifullah was also very brave. He didn't have any rancor, no anger, even though the United States had dropped him off with the Italians and never checked to find out how he was doing, or did he need prostheses or vocational rehab. But I asked Saifullah, if there was ever a night raid at your house, what would you do? And he said, I would fight. I would fight to the death. What is the work of the life without the family? And these boys had almost become like family together, being in the hospital together. The hospital lawn was a lush green grass, and there were roses on either side. And when it was sunny and the sky was blue, they'd help each other with their prostheses and their IVs and take the sheets and set them down. And there were Pashto and Hazara and Tajik and Uzbek, and they'd sit and joke together. But there was one little boy, Atitullah, and he would never leave the hospital. He wanted to help his family. He was like one of these hundreds of thousands of hard-working little kids. And his hope was that if he found a landmine and opened it up, he could extract the brass. Well, there are landmines obliterating the mountainside for multiple wars all across Afghanistan. And if you get that brass out and sell it at the marketplace, it's a very precious find. But he had very bad luck that day. When he opened it up, it exploded and it took off 3 of his fingers, and 1 of his eyes were damaged beyond repair. And Adidullah was depressed. And so I think about the children in Afghanistan, the children in Iraq, the people for whom the war doesn't really ever end. The war doesn't end when it's over, because they carry the traumas, they carry the wounds, they carry the loss. And for us, in many ways, even if we've forgotten that these wars are even still going on, in some ways they don't end. They don't end for the veterans that come back, some of them not until their dying day. The wars don't end in ways that we can think about in terms of what would have happened with our infrastructure, with our capacity to solve world problems, to eradicate hunger, to get rid of disease, if these billions and billions and billions of dollars had gone pouring into the scourge of warfare. And so it's very good for us to be here together tonight to think about the cost of war and the price of peace. One price of peace is to tell the truth about these wars. One of the ways to stop the next war is to tell the truth about this present war. And so I've asked Anne McCarthy to help me out. There's a man who tried very hard to tell about a very obscure war in the Seychelles. The United Kingdom had recruited Irish soldiers to go and fight in the Seychelles, and they were conscripts. They didn't have any stake in that war whatsoever. But many of them came back very wounded and traumatized. And so Padre Colin wrote a song, and I think that some of you have heard this song before, but you've heard it with the words, "When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah." But actually that melody goes with words that preceded our Johnny Comes Marching Home. And these are the words to the song that are being passed out to you now. And this song was written by a man named Padre Colin. And thank you very much, those of you who are passing the words out to this song. And Anne and I, you're very welcome to join us. We've had a little chance to practice this, but it's a pretty easy melody that might be familiar. While going the road to sweet Athy-Haroo, Haroo. While going the road to sweet Athy-Haroo, Haroo. While going the road to sweet Athy, a stick in my hand and a drop in my eye. But all the damsel I would cry, but Johnny I hardly knew ya. With drums and guns and guns and drums, Haroo. With drums and guns and guns and drums, hurroo, hurroo. With drums and guns and guns and drums, the enemy nearly slew ya. My darling dear, you look so queer. Oh, Johnny, I hardly knew ya. Where are your eyes that look so mild, hurroo, hurroo? Where are your eyes that look so mild? You haven't an arm put a foot out of the bed every morning, who look for a way to be part of swearing to put an end to war. And Joe Clark will give us Stan Berrigan's wise words that help us understand why.
Some by Dan Berrigan. Some stood up once and sat down. Some walked a mile and walked away. Some stood up twice, then sat down. I've had it, they said. Some walked 2 miles, then walked away. It's too much, they cried. Some stood and stood and stood. They were taken for fools. They were taken for being taken in. Some walked and walked and walked. They walked the earth. They walked the waters. They walked the air. Why do you stand, they were asked, and why do you walk? Because of the children, they said, and because of the heart, and because of the bread. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread.
Thank you, Joe. Because the cause is the heart's beat, and the children born, and the risen bread. I'd like to share with you one 3-minute video of one of my favorite children in Afghanistan. This is Zagrola, and we just need to dim the lights. And Zagrola is peeling potatoes, and he's being asked questions by Hakim, who's speaking to him in Dari. Hakim's a medical doctor from Singapore, and he's a great good friend to these children. He's the mentor for the Afghan Peace Volunteers. If you yourself would ever like to be in touch with them, on the 21st of every month they have a Skype phone call when they all get together, and people from all around the world talk to them on this call. Could we dim the lights? Thank you. Actually, I'm sorry, we'll start with a different one. And I hope you can hear, there is music in the background. This first one is Gunamai and Ali going out to collect fuel. So that's Ali and Gurmai, and in that one scene, the person on the right was Dr. Hakim, who has been with the people of Afghanistan now for 11 years. The next one is Hakim interviewing Zebullah. In terms of humanity, all of us are human beings. Thank you for your kind attention to these thoughts, and I would very much appreciate hearing from you now. Your ideas, comments, objections, criticisms, questions. We have a chunk of time for that. I do have several maps that with Dan's help I'll get want to show just to kind of situate where this idea comes from, that maybe the United States geopolitically has some other aims for being in Afghanistan other than protecting women and children. But first, you've heard so much from me. Do you have any questions, thoughts? I think that maybe Marlene has an extra microphone.
Kathy, why did you mention about the drone operators and their rate of suicide, the men that are returning Saturday, I think?
Thank you, Audrey. Audrey is mentioning that, people talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm almost queasy about saying disorder, because I think if people are stressed, it's predictable, and it's something that you would expect, really. But, some might say, well, these people that operate the drones, they don't go into the battlefield arena And so it's cowardly of the United States. And I myself, I don't believe in ever sending anybody, young or old, into war. I don't believe in it. I want to change our societies and abolish warfare. But I don't think we should think about the drone operation as something that's very removed from the battlefield. Because in fact, if you can imagine that it's your job to be doing surveillance. So, like for instance, a 3-car convoy that had been going along a mountain road. And at one point, some U.S. paratroopers were dropped 12 miles away from where the convoy was going along the road. Well, the convoy was carrying women and children and grandmothers who were going outside their village for the first time in a lifetime to another province for medical care and to do some shopping and another long trip. But the people looking at the screen just detected 3 vehicles that could be a threat to the paratroopers who were doing a reconnaissance mission and had just landed on the ground. And they didn't have a lot of time to make decisions. So what happens is a kill chain is invoked. And the people of the kill chain are supposed to examine the data as it comes in. And they actually had 4 drone operators doing constant surveillance in a matter of minutes, trying to figure out as much as they could about this 3-car convoy. But as it got closer, a decision had to be made. And so one drone operator had actually figured out that there was a woman nursing a baby in one of the vehicles. And he was trying like mad to get his message up to the top of the stack of messages so that people would not attack the convoy. But the New York Times described it as being like a lost email. His message just didn't get in there, and so the first car exploded, and the women in the second car leaped out, and they were waving their long scarves, crying out, "Civilians, civilians!" But that car was attacked, and those women didn't survive. The third car was not attacked, because people figured out these are civilians. Well, if you could imagine, that you're at your job, and you're in one of these tense situations where they're trying to decide, maybe you've been tracking with somebody for weeks, and now this person is going into a restaurant, and you pinpointed, he's in the doorway, this is the chance, and so they give the order, and the order is impact, and the Hellfire missile fires, you just fired it, and then that person's body parts are flying all over, and other people have been killed as well, and then you look at the clock, and you say to your partner, "Hey man, I gotta go, I'm supposed to pick up my kid at the soccer field." Whew. It's a very traumatizing reality that the Air Force personnel are recording, and they're going for help, some of them. I don't hardly know about rates of suicide amongst drone operators. We just have this kind of across-the-board, startling and terrible statistic about a rise in suicides, and as I mentioned before, more deaths caused by suicide amongst veterans than from combat-related deaths in the war in Afghanistan. Other questions, thoughts?
Kathy, why are we in Afghanistan, in your opinion?
The question is, why are we in Afghanistan, in my opinion? There have been many different reasons given over the course of the war in Afghanistan. We were in Afghanistan because they were holding up, they knew where Osama bin Laden was. And that's why George Bush ordered the first raining down of bombs in Afghanistan. And the Taliban had been displaced out of government, but they have now been coming back. Now, President Bush and now President Obama have said that we will dismantle and eradicate Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda is not the Taliban. Leon Panetta was asked, how many Al-Qaeda operatives do you think there are in Afghanistan today? And he said, about 57. You could take Ohio Wesleyan soccer team and give them $2 billion a week, and I'll bet they could try and round up 57 Al-Qaeda figures in Afghanistan. $2 billion a week? It's just something doesn't quite wash. Why is it that we're there? Could I get the maps up? I think we're in a Cold War with China. The United States doesn't want to say that because economically we're quite indebted to China. And China doesn't want to say it to the United States, but I think it's true that economically we're in a very intense, fierce competition with China. And you can see that the border between Afghanistan and China is just that little tiny, it almost looks like a peninsula that juts out there. But Afghanistan borders China. Now, China has a long border with Pakistan. And the only country, go back to the first one, the only country in the Muslim world that has the nuclear bomb is Pakistan. So the United States is very wary about Chinese-Pakistani relationships, very wary very wary about the possibilities geopolitically. Oh, maybe I'll just see if I can put it with this. Sorry. So in this map you can see the long border that Pakistan shares with China, the long border that Pakistan has with Iran. So up above those stems you'll have Russia. And so Afghanistan geopolitically is situated in a way that makes it a very relevant country for other struggles that the United States is part of. But also, in this map, you have a man in 2006 who was appointed to try to make a map that would show a rearrangement of borders that would better serve United States national interests. So the left-hand borders are true. That really is the long border that Afghanistan shares with Pakistan and with Iran and with China, just that little short border. The right-hand side is what Mr. Ralph Peters imagined would be a better map in terms of U.S. interests. And so you see that that whole southern area of Pakistan breaks away on the right-hand side and becomes Baluchistan. Baluchistan is a separate country from Pakistan. Now that's not unthinkable. There is tremendous antagonism by the Baluch tribes toward the Pakistani government. But if Baluchistan broke away, Pakistan becomes a smaller country, and the United States doesn't have to worry about Pakistan and Iran sharing a border. There's more isolation in Pakistan. Then you notice in the second map, Afghanistan's northern border sort of curves over, and it becomes Afghanistan that has the long border with China, not Pakistan. And then Afghanistan's eastern border just sort of moves further so that the area where the nuclear bombs are located in Pakistan now becomes Afghan territory. So this is a kind of an old map by now, but I can tell you that in 2010, when I was in Pakistan, and in 2009, every affluent, well-educated person I spoke with who spoke English, and I didn't speak Urdu or Punjabi or any other, so I really needed to talk with the English-speaking people, knew about this map and said they fully expected that this would be their future. I first saw the map in the New York Times. Now the next map we might call Pipelinistan. This is Abdullah, and can we just race through these? Those are the Afghan Peace Volunteers. That's that refugee camp. Come. Oh, careful. bad I can't see this, but there we go. This map shows what some believe is the main reason why the United States does not want to leave Afghanistan, Pipelineistan. That blue blob up near the top left-hand side is the Caspian Sea. Around the Caspian Sea are huge reserves of natural gas and fossil fuels. The United States does not want China and Russia to have access to those energy sources at cheaper rates than what we pay. So if the United States could build a pipeline through which the natural gas and the fossil fuels would be transported, then the United States could charge money for using that pipeline and control the pricing and the flow of the resources. It isn't so much that the United States is saying, we want to put that gas or that fuel in our gas tanks. The United States is saying, we want to control the pricing and the flow of those resources. So in 2008, when the NATO troops met in Lisbon, Spain, the NATO countries were exultant because the Asia Development Bank had said, we'll underwrite that pipeline. Go ahead and try building it. The United States had tried with the Unocal company to build that pipeline back in the 1990s, but it didn't go very far. In fact, Hamid Karzai, now the president of Afghanistan, was on the board of directors for Unocal to build that project. They really want this project to go. Now, if you're a Taliban fighter, and you know that the enemy you're fighting against, and the Taliban has said, we don't care what troop levels you have in Afghanistan, as long as there are foreigners here, we'll fight them. If you know that the foreigners want, if you know the foreigners want to build that pipeline, blow it up. So what can the U.S. do to try and assure that hostile fighters aren't blowing up their pipeline? Well, it would help a lot to have drone surveillance, to have forward operating bases with special operating forces who could identify anybody who's threatening that pipeline, pull them in for interrogation, imprison them, deter them because they would be so frightened of what might happen to them or their families. Now, the other thing that is very, very valuable in the Hindu Kush Mountains in the northern mountainous areas of Afghanistan is the presence of what are called rare earth minerals. In your cell phones, in our computers, we have lithium and dithium, and these very, very valuable minerals. People all over the world are using cell phones and computers these days. They are quickly running through the supplies of these minerals. The United States, again, wants to have control over the pricing and the flow of these resources. And so Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, talked about the new Silk roadways. Some of you would remember reading about the Silk Route in your geography books. Well, these would be the new Silk roadways. They want to build roads across Afghanistan so that the minerals can be extracted and transported. Now, China and Russia are more or less interested in stabilization of Afghanistan so that they can derive economic advantages. Iran is fighting a proxy war. Pakistan is fighting a proxy war in Afghanistan. So there are all of these fighters that are concentrated, some of them are being funded from abroad, and it seems like this war could go on and on and on. And why worry if you're a politician? The U.S. public forgot about the war before it even ended. And we don't have a draft. We don't have a very high concentration of our population experiencing ill effects from the war. The war profiteers are making pots and pots of money on the opportunity to sell their weapons and make new drones. The drone industry is like the Lady Gaga of the industry now. And so you just aren't going to find people saying, stop this war. Unless we say that we no longer want to be a warlike, menacing people. live without wars. So I just want to invite all of you to be part of the Afghan Peace Volunteers efforts. They're dying for people to join them. Every month they have a Skype phone call, so that's certainly one opportunity. There are many, many actions going on across country concerning the drones and stopping the drone warfare. You could go to the Voices website and become further involved with us, but I know that Benedictines for Peace will also be constantly inviting you to come to places where people gather, sometimes inside Congress people and senators' offices, asking them, why are we doing this? Take Bob's question to your faith-based community, to your university classes, to your congresspeople, your senators, the local media, and we have a right to be asking, why? $3 trillion has now been spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what has been accomplished? Bereavement, displacement, antagonism. The United States has lost its standing in the Middle East and in Central Asia, and economically, China is quickly catching up with us because they're not spending such huge proportions of their income and resources on building up the capacity to kill and destroy. So because of the children, because of the risen bread, the hearts beat. Thank you all. I just want to check if there are any other questions.
Kathy, would you say something about the debate and volunteers?
Okay.
That's the most hopeful part.
Oh, Marlene is reminding me that a very, very hopeful aspect of what's been happening in Afghanistan has to do with what we call the debate project. I mentioned children freezing to death in the camps, and women have come to us and said, I think I'm losing my mind. I think I am going mad because they can't feed their children. So the Afghan Peace Volunteers invited these women to come into their own home and make these very big, heavy blankets, which were then distributed for free to the people that are living out in the cold and most at risk of freezing to death and to keep their children warm. Each mother that came for a blanket got 2 heavy blankets, and then the women who made them got at least enough of a meager salary to be able to feed their families. So I felt so encouraged by this project. We were able to raise $40,000 within really a matter of a couple of months to keep that project going. And I'm very grateful to Benedictines for Peace and other cooperative groups who sent us a check, and there's also been further funding raised for that. And many of the women that the kids found, and they really would, fan out on these mountainsides and go up and look for the poorest of women, widows and orphans who get pushed up the mountainside because if water is piped into homes, then the rent goes up and they can't afford it, so they go higher and higher to little hovels where there's no running water. They have to go down 25 minutes on these icy, treacherous roads, get the water from below, strap down their backs, walk up the mountainside for another 25 minutes. And these are the women who had so little access to fuel that they were shelling almonds all day long and using the almond shells for fuel and then selling the almonds in the marketplace. Desperately poor women. And so the young people would say, come down the mountain at this day, at this place, and we'll at least give you these big heavy blankets. It was a great project. So they'll start up again in the autumn with the duvet project. Duvet is a French word for big heavy blanket. They're stuffed with wool.
Thank Kathy for